The Wyoming sky was a relentless, infinite blue. A canvas so vast it made the creaking of the wagon wheels seem a small and fragile sound. Lila Harper held the seat beside her husband, her hands folded neatly over the white linen of her wedding dress. The dress, a simple thing her mother had sewn with trembling fingers, felt foreign against her skin, a costume for a life she had not yet begun to live. They had been married for 2 days, a blur of hurried vows in a dusty town courthouse before setting out for the great emptiness of the West. This was to be their home, his home. Joel cleared his throat, the sound rough and possessive. "See that peak over there?" He pointed with a thick finger. "That is Harper land, all the way from there to the creek. Our land now." Lila nodded, her gaze following his direction but seeing little more than a jagged line against the horizon. The land did not feel like hers. It felt like a wild thing, untamed and indifferent, and she felt like a canary brought into a wolf's den. Joel had been a stranger to her just a month ago, a business arrangement made between her father and his. He was handsome in a severe sort of way, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of faded denim, but there was a hardness in him she had not anticipated. In the last 2 days, his polite words had developed a sharp edge, his touch a claim rather than a comfort. "You are quiet, wife," he said, not looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the trail ahead. "It is a lot to take in," she answered softly. The wind pulled a strand of her dark hair from its pins and whipped it across her face. "You will get used to it," he stated, as if her feelings were a piece of unruly luggage to be settled. "A woman's place is to adapt. My mother adapted. You will too." He reached over and tucked the stray piece of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering a moment too long, a silent reminder of his ownership. The sun began its slow descent, painting the plains in hues of orange and deep purple. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. They were meant to reach the ranch by nightfall, a welcoming party of his family awaiting them. The thought filled Lila with a fresh wave of anxiety. To be judged by strangers, to be measured and weighed as Joel's bride, felt like another ordeal in a long line of them. The first sign of trouble was the sudden, sharp crack that was not thunder. It was closer, deadlier. The lead horse screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of pain and terror, and reared violently. The wagon lurched, throwing Lila against Joel. He grunted, shoving her back into her seat as he reached for the rifle propped beside him. "Stay down!" he barked, his face a mask of sudden, ugly fury. Another crack echoed through the twilight. The world dissolved into chaos. The horses, now frantic, tore at their harnesses. The wagon bucked and twisted. Lila saw a flash of movement in the rocks to their left, a silhouette of a man against the dying light. Joel raised his rifle, but he was too slow. A third shot rang out, and Joel's body jerked backward as if struck by an invisible fist. A dark stain, impossibly fast, blossomed on the crisp white of his wedding shirt, right over his heart. His eyes went wide, a look of profound surprise replacing the anger. He made a small, wet sound, a question that would never be answered. And then he slumped sideways, his dead weight falling against her. The warmth of his blood soaked through her dress, a shocking, intimate heat. For a moment, she could not breathe, could not think. The horses, finally breaking free from the splintering traces, galloped madly into the darkness, their panicked whinnies fading into the vast silence of the prairie. The wagon tilted, its front axle snapped, and pitched onto its side with a groan of tortured wood. Lila was thrown clear, her head striking something hard. She landed in the dirt and sagebrush, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of pain and fading light. The last thing she saw was the flicker of a lantern near the rocks, and the last thing she heard was the low chuckle of a man who was not her husband. Then, only darkness. She woke to the cold, a deep, bone-aching cold that the Wyoming night seemed to specialize in. A sliver of moon offered a pale, ghostly light. Her head throbbed with a dull, persistent beat, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She sat up, the torn and dirtied fabric of her wedding dress stiff with drying blood. Joel's blood. The memory crashed down on her. A physical blow. "Joel?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. The wagon lay on its side like a great wounded beast. The supplies they had carried, sacks of flour, tools, and her small wooden trunk of belongings, were scattered across the ground. And Joel, he was still there, half in and half out of the ruined wagon, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open, staring at the indifferent stars. A wave of nausea and terror washed over Lila. She scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady. She had to run. From what, she did not know. The men from the rocks, the silence, the sight of her dead husband. She turned and stumbled away from the wreckage, her only thought to put distance between herself and the horror. She did not choose a direction. She simply moved, a ghost in a ruined wedding dress, tripping over rocks and pushing through thorny brush. The fine linen, meant for a wedding bed, tore on sagebrush and snagged on rocks, leaving fluttering white flags in her wake. She walked until her feet were raw and her mind was a hollow chamber of shock. The single, repeating image of Joel's surprised eyes burned into her memory. Sometime before dawn, she fell. She did not have the strength to get up again. She curled into herself, the cold seeping into her bones, and surrendered to the encroaching darkness, the whispering wind her only lullaby. Eli Thatcher found her just after sunrise. He was checking his trap lines, a routine he performed with the grim efficiency of a man who preferred the company of solitude. He had seen the buzzards circling from a distance and had ridden his gray gelding, Boulder, to investigate, expecting a dead coyote or a lost calf. He did not expect to find a woman. She was lying near a cluster of rocks, looking like a broken doll someone had discarded. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, matted with dirt and leaves. Her face was pale, scratched, and bruised, but it was the dress that held his attention. A white wedding dress, now torn, stained with dirt and a large, dark patch of dried blood. She was breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. For a long moment, Eli just sat on his horse, watching her. His first instinct was to ride on. Trouble. This was nothing but trouble, and he had left trouble behind him years ago when he had taken off the blue coat of the army. A woman like this, in a state like this, meant questions. It meant the town, the sheriff, the whole damned world he had worked so hard to keep at a distance. He had his cabin, his horses, and the silence. It was all he needed. It was all he deserved. He closed his eyes, but the image of another woman, another blood-soaked dress, flashed behind his lids. Smoke, screaming, the weight of a dying girl in his arms. Clara, her name a ghost on his tongue. He had tried to save her during a border raid in a town that no longer existed on any map. He had been young, arrogant, a soldier who believed he could make a difference. He had pulled her from a burning building, but a stray bullet had found her, and she had bled out in his arms, her blood staining his coat the same way this woman's dress was stained. He had failed. That failure was a brand on his soul, with a curse that was more a prayer of resignation. He dismounted. He could not leave her here to die. Whatever guilt he carried for the past, he could not add this to it. He knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. He checked her pulse. It was weak but steady. He gently brushed the hair from her face. Her eyelids fluttered. She moaned softly, a sound of pure misery. "Easy now," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "You are safe." He was not sure if she heard him. Her eyes opened, but they were unfocused, looking through him rather than at him. He carefully scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, all sharp angles and fragile bones. She did not resist, but a low whimper escaped her lips as he lifted her. He carried her to his horse, mounted, and settled her in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. As he nudged Boulder into a slow walk toward his cabin, he could feel the faint, ragged tremor of her breathing. A fragile life held against his own. His cabin was a small, rough-hewn structure tucked into a grove of cottonwoods by a narrow creek. It was not much, but it was sturdy, and it was his. He carried her inside and laid her gently on his cot, the only piece of soft furniture in the single room. The place smelled of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A simple table and 2 chairs sat in the middle of the room, and shelves holding tins of food. A few books and ammunition lined another wall. He built up the fire in the hearth, filling the room with a welcome warmth. Then he turned his attention back to the woman. He needed to tend to her wounds and get her out of that terrible dress. He filled a basin with warm water from the kettle and brought it to the cot with a clean cloth. "I need to clean these cuts," he said, more to himself than to her. "And check for broken bones." She watched him with those same vacant eyes. He gently began to clean the scrapes on her face and arms. She flinched but did not pull away. When he tried to unbutton the top of her dress, however, her reaction was immediate and violent. She recoiled, pulling the blood-stained fabric tighter around herself. A guttural "no" tearing from her throat. Her eyes were suddenly sharp, focused, and filled with a wild, cornered terror. "The dress has to come off," he said calmly, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. "It is ruined. You need to be warm." "No," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, shaking with a desperate finality. She clutched the torn lace at her collar, her knuckles white. "No." Eli did not push. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who had seen too much. The mind, when broken, clung to strange anchors. For her, it was this dress. He let out a slow breath and simply draped a thick wool blanket over her instead. She immediately pulled it up to her chin, her eyes never leaving his face, watching him as a hawk watches a snake. He saw then that she was not just hurt, she was shattered. For 3 days, she barely spoke. She existed in a silent world of grief and shock, moving between the cot and the chair by the fire. She ate the broth he made for her when he insisted, but she seemed to have no appetite, no will, and she would not, under any circumstances, remove the dress. It hung on her thin frame, a constant, grim reminder of the tragedy that had brought her to his door. Eli watched her, his own solitude disrupted by her fragile, silent presence. He found himself talking to her, filling the silence with observations about the weather or the habits of the deer that came to the creek. He did not expect answers, and he received none. At night, the terror she held at bay during the day came for her. She would cry out in her sleep, short, sharp cries of fear. She whispered names and phrases he could not understand. "Joel, the light! Do not!" Sometimes, she would sit bolt upright, her eyes wide with a nightmare he could not see. One night, he woke to the sound of the cabin door opening. He was on his feet in an instant, his pistol in his hand, to find her standing on the threshold, ready to walk back out into the unforgiving wilderness. He gently took her arm. "It is the middle of the night," he said softly. "You cannot go out there." She looked at him, her face bathed in moonlight, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of clarity in her eyes, a deep and bottomless well of sorrow. "I do not belong here," she whispered. "You belong nowhere out there," he countered, guiding her back inside. "You are safe here." He wondered if it was a lie. He was a stranger to her, a man with his own ghosts. But as he settled her back onto the cot and added another log to the fire, he knew he could not send her away. He considered riding into the nearest town, Clayton, to fetch the sheriff or a doctor, but it was a full day's ride, and he was reluctant to leave her alone in this state. What if she ran again? What if she hurt herself? So he stayed, a reluctant warden to her prison of grief. On the 4th day, the world found them. Eli was chopping wood when he heard the clatter of a horse and buggy. He straightened up, his hand resting on the axe handle. His eyes narrowed. Visitors were rare, and rarely welcome. It was Silas Croft, the mail carrier, a wiry man with a face full of gossip and a nose for any story that was not his own. "Thatcher," Silas called out, pulling his tired-looking horse to a halt. "Did not figure you for having company." His eyes darted toward the cabin door, where Lila stood. Drawn by the sound, she looked like a wraith, pale and haunted in her sullied white dress. Silas's eyes widened. He knew everyone and everything within a 100-mile radius. "Good heavens," he breathed, his gaze fixed on Lila. That's Joel Harper's new bride, Lila. They were expected at the Harper Ranch days ago. The whole family's been worried sick." Eli stepped between Silas and the cabin, a silent, immovable barrier. "She had an accident. Her wagon overturned. Her husband is dead." Silas's gaze flickered from Lila's disheveled state to Eli's grim face. The mail carrier's mind, always turning, began to spin a new and more interesting tale than a simple accident. A young bride, a dead husband, found alone at the cabin of a recluse like Eli Thatcher. It was the stuff of legend. "An accident," Silas repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. I see. I best get to town. The Harpers need to know. The sheriff needs to know." He did not wait for a reply. He snapped the reins, turning the buggy around with a haste that betrayed his eagerness to deliver this shocking news. Eli watched him go, a knot tightening in his gut. He knew what would happen now. Silas would not tell the story as it was. He would tell it as he saw it, and the people of Clayton would add their own cruel flourishes. By sundown, the story would be that the bride had killed her husband, or that she was a cursed woman who brought death with her, or that she and Eli Thatcher were in it together. Guilt was a thing a town like Clayton assigned quickly, especially to outsiders, and this woman was now the ultimate outsider. He turned and looked at Lila, who had retreated back into the shadows of the cabin. She was a storm that had landed on his doorstep, and he knew, with a grim certainty, that the wind and the rain were just beginning. Later that evening, after she had fallen into a troubled sleep, Eli rode out to the site of the attack. He had avoided it before, not wanting to see the proof of what she had survived. But now he needed to know. He needed facts to fight the fictions that were surely being spun in town. He found the wreckage easily enough. The wagon was still on its side, picked over by scavengers, both animal and human. He found Joel Harper's body where Lila had left it, and with a grim sense of duty, he covered it with a canvas sheet from the wreckage, a small, inadequate gesture of respect. As he surveyed the scene in the fading light, his soldier's eye for detail took over. He knelt by the broken axle. The brake was jagged, violent, consistent with the wagon overturning. But then he saw something else. He ran his fingers over the heavy leather traces that had connected the horses to the wagon. One was snapped, but the other was cut. A clean, straight slice made by a sharp knife. It was not the kind of damage a panicked horse would make. It was deliberate, sabotage. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the surrounding rocks. It had been an ambush, not a random robbery on the trail. Someone had waited for them. Someone had cut the harness to ensure the horses would break free and the wagon would be stranded. Someone had wanted Joel Harper dead, and they had not cared if his new bride died with him. This was not a story of bad luck. It was murder, and the woman sleeping in his cabin was the only witness. The silence in the cabin had changed. It was no longer the empty, hollow silence of a woman lost in shock, but a tense, brittle thing, filled with unspoken words. Lila had begun to speak, but her words were like shards of glass, sharp and liable to draw blood. She had woken that morning, the morning after Eli had returned from the wreck, and found him watching her from his chair by the fire. "Stop looking at me," she had said, her voice a low rasp. It was the first full sentence she had offered him. Eli had simply nodded and turned his attention to the coffee pot. There is stew, he said, his voice even. You need to eat. When he placed the bowl on the small table, she stared at it as if it were poison. I am not a charity case. Never said you were, he replied, sitting down opposite her. Food is for the living. You are still living. The words hung in the air between them. Her hand trembled as she picked up the spoon. She ate, but her movements were stiff, her jaw tight with a resentment that seemed to have no specific target, landing on him simply because he was there. The grief had found its voice, and that voice was rage. She was furious at the world, at her fate, and most of all, at the pity she saw in his quiet, steady gaze. He tried to offer her a clean shirt of his and a pair of trousers he thought might fit her small frame, something practical to replace the ruined dress. She refused, her eyes flashing with a protective fire. This is mine, she said, her fingers clutching the blood-stained linen. He saw then that it was not about mourning Joel, not entirely. It was something deeper. He pushed a little, his voice gentle. It is just a dress. Lila. He had learned her name from the mail carrier, and using it felt both necessary and like a trespass. No, it is not, she snapped, her voice breaking. It is the last thing I have of me. The woman who got in that wagon, she is gone. This is all that is left of her. He did not ask again. He understood, in a way he could not quite articulate, the need to cling to a tangible piece of a life that had been violently erased. His own anchor was a small, tarnished silver locket he kept in his saddlebag, a thing that had belonged to Clara. He never looked at it, but he always knew it was there. He watched her over the next few days, a man studying a wounded, unpredictable animal. He saw the waves of shame that followed her anger. After an outburst, she would retreat into herself, wrapping her arms around her knees, her face pale and drawn. She would stare into the fire for hours. Lost in a place he could not follow, he still heard her at night, whispering in her sleep. The same fragmented terrors. He sensed a wall around the memory of that night, a part of the story she was not telling, perhaps not even to herself. His discovery of the cut harness was a secret he kept, a hard stone in his pocket. He did not know how to ask her about it without shattering the fragile truce they had established. He was not a man skilled in delicate conversations. He was a man who fixed what was broken with his hands, and her wounds were far beyond his craft. His supplies began to run low. The coffee was nearly gone, and the sack of flour was getting dangerously light. He needed salt, ammunition, and perhaps some bandages that were not made from a torn flour sack. He had to go to town. The thought settled in his stomach with the weight of dread. He knew what awaited him in Clayton. Silas Croft's story would have spread like a prairie fire, fanned by the winds of boredom and suspicion, but it had to be done. I'm riding into town, he told her one morning, trying to keep his tone casual. I will be back by nightfall. Her head snapped up. The guarded calm on her face was instantly replaced by a stark, raw panic. You are leaving me here, alone? You will be safe. Bolt the door. Keep the rifle close. He gestured to the Winchester leaning against the wall. No one will bother you out here. You do not know that, she said, her voice rising. They will come. The men from the rocks. The men from the rocks are long gone, he said, more firmly than he intended. This is about supplies. Lila, we need them. Her face hardened, the panic freezing back into anger. Then go, she said, turning her back to him. It makes no difference to me. He knew it was a lie, but he did not know how to breach the wall of her pride. He saddled bolder, his movements methodical, his mind troubled. As he rode away, he glanced back at the cabin. The door was closed. He could feel her watching him from the small, grimy window, a silent, furious sentinel in her tattered white dress. The ride to Clayton was tense. The open plains, usually a source of comfort to him, felt menacing, watched. Every rock formation seemed to hold a shadow. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. By the time he saw the dusty cluster of buildings that made up the town, his shoulders were tight with apprehension. He tied Boulder in front of the mercantile, his eyes scanning the street. He saw it immediately. The way people stopped talking as he passed, the way women on the boardwalk pulled their children closer, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. He was no stranger to being an outsider in this town. His solitary nature had always kept them at arm's length. But this was different. This was the stare reserved for a leper or a hangman. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the smell of pickles, leather, and unspoken judgment. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man who usually offered a grudging but polite greeting, simply stared at him, his hands frozen on the counter. "Thatcher," Henderson finally managed, his voice low. "Needs supplies," Eli said, his voice flat. He began to list what he needed, his words falling like stones into a silent pond. A few men loafing by the Cracker Barrel stopped their whittling and watched him, their expressions unreadable but hostile. As Henderson measured out the flour, one of the men spoke, his voice loud enough to carry, "Heard you took in some bad luck. Thatcher, some say that girl is cursed. Husband dead on her wedding night? Ain't natural." Another man snorted. "Cursed is one word for it. My wife's cousin heard from Silas Croft that she didn't have a scratch on her. Strange, for a wagon wreck that killed a man." Eli's hand tightened into a fist at his side. He turned his head slowly and fixed the speaker with a cold, level stare. The man, a farmer with mean little eyes, faltered and looked away, suddenly finding his whittling very interesting. Eli paid for his goods, his movements deliberate. He could feel their eyes on his back as he carried the sacks out to his horse. The whispers were a poison, and they were already infecting the whole town. He knew he should leave, ride back to the relative peace of his cabin. But a cold anger was churning in his gut. He needed to face the source of this trouble. He needed to find Joel Harper's family. He found Joel's brother, Caleb, coming out of the saloon. Caleb Harper was a taller, leaner version of his brother, with the same hard eyes but a crueler set to his mouth. He was dressed in black, a performance of grief that did not reach his eyes. He saw Eli and stopped, a look of contempt twisting his features. "Thatcher," Caleb said, his voice a low drawl. "I heard you found my brother's widow." He said the word as if it were an insult. "I found a survivor," Eli corrected him, his voice dangerously quiet. "She is at my cabin. She is unwell." Caleb laughed, a short, ugly sound with no humor in it. "Unwell? I imagine she is. She brings trouble wherever she goes. My father was a fool to ever approve the match." Joel was blinded by a pretty face. "Her husband was murdered," Eli said, watching Caleb's face carefully. "Your brother was murdered." Caleb's expression did not change. There was no flicker of sorrow, only a cold, reptilian stillness. The trail is a dangerous place, a lesson she should have learned. She was never one of us, Thatcher. Just some girl from the East with soft hands and secrets. It would have been better for everyone if she had stayed in that wagon. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a thread of pure venom. "That girl should have burned with the wagon." The raw hatred in Caleb's voice struck Eli with the force of a physical blow. This was not the grief of a brother. This was something else, something dark and possessive. Eli's hand instinctively went to the pistol at his hip, but he held himself in check. A fight here, now, would only prove the gossips right. "You tell her the Harper family wants nothing to do with her." Caleb sneered. "She is not welcome at the ranch. She is not welcome in this town. Whatever bad luck she carries, you can keep it." He pushed past Eli, his shoulder bumping his deliberately, and walked down the street without looking back. The ride back to the cabin was a blur of cold fury. Caleb's words echoed in his mind, confirming his suspicions. The cut harness, the coldness of a grieving brother, the whispers in town. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple robbery. Lila was not just a victim of circumstance, she was a target. And by taking her in, he had painted a target on his own back. As he rode, the sky began to bruise, the blue fading to a dark, angry gray. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons with a mournful cry. The temperature dropped. A storm was coming. A proper Wyoming blizzard that could trap a man for days. He urged Boulder on, his concern for Lila overriding his anger. To be alone in the cabin, with a storm like this bearing down, would feed the very terrors she fought to keep at bay. He was right. When he reached the clearing, the cabin was dark. A frantic fear seized him. He dismounted, not bothering to tie up his horse, and threw open the door. The room was cold, the fire nothing but dying embers. Lila was huddled in the chair, wrapped in the blanket, shivering. She looked up at him, and he was shocked by the wild, desperate look in her eyes. It was not anger. It was pure, unadulterated terror. "You came back," she whispered, as if she had truly believed he would not. "I said I would," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He quickly shut the door against the first flurries of snow and went to the hearth, his hands working mechanically to rebuild the fire. "Why did you leave me?" she cried, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. "You left me alone. They could have come back." "No one came back. Lila, you were safe." "I was not safe," she screamed, jumping to her feet. The blanket fell away, revealing the torn wedding dress, a symbol of her unending nightmare. "I am never safe. I will never be safe again." She was shaking from head to foot, her control finally, completely gone. The storm outside seemed to have entered the small cabin. A whirlwind of fear and despair centered on her. He moved toward her, his hands outstretched. "Lila, calm down." "Do not tell me to be calm," she sobbed, backing away from him until her back was against the rough log wall. "You do not understand. You leave me here to die, just like everyone else." Tears streamed down her face, cutting clean paths through the grime. Her body was racked with violent, shuddering sobs. She looked like she was about to fly apart, to shatter into a million pieces right there on the cabin floor. All the anger, all the pride, all the defenses she had built were gone, washed away in a torrent of grief and fear. He did not know what to do. The soldier in him knew how to handle wounds of the flesh, but this was a wound of the soul. He stood there, helpless, as her cries filled the small room, a sound more desolate than the howling of the wind. Then she stopped crying. A strange, unnerving stillness came over her. She looked at him, her eyes wide and dark in the flickering firelight. She took a staggering step toward him, then another. She reached out and grabbed the front of his shirt, her grip surprisingly strong. She pulled herself against him, her body trembling, her face buried in his chest. He could feel the frantic, terrified beating of her heart against his own. He stood frozen, his arms stiff at his sides. He could smell the dust and the sorrow on her, the faint, lingering scent of blood on the old linen of her dress. He was about to put a comforting hand on her back when she tilted her head up to look at him. Her face was a ruin of tear tracks and desperation. Her lips were parted, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Kiss me," she whispered, her voice so low it was almost lost in the storm. It was not a request. It was a plea, a demand born of absolute desperation. He stared down at her, confused. This was not desire, not in any way he had ever known it. This was something else entirely. "Lila," he began, but she cut him off, her grip tightening on his shirt. "Please," she begged, her eyes searching his, pleading with him to understand something she could not say. "Kiss me like I am dying." Her words hit him like a physical blow. "Kiss me like I am dying." He understood then. This was not about passion. It was about oblivion. It was a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, other than the crushing weight of her reality. It was a cry for a moment of life so intense it could blot out the memory of death. He saw the ghosts in her eyes, the same ones he carried in his own soul. He saw the abyss she was standing on the edge of, and in that moment, he could not refuse her. He lowered his head slowly and touched his lips to hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was raw, desperate, and filled with a shared, unspoken pain. It was the taste of salt from her tears, of dust from the trail, of a grief so profound it had no words. He did not embrace her, but his hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking away the tears on her cheeks. It was a kiss of pure, agonizing emotion. A collision of two broken people finding a fleeting, desperate anchor in a world that had tried to drown them both. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment, the storm inside the cabin fell silent. When he pulled away, she did not look at him. She rested her forehead against his chest, her breathing still ragged. The fire crackled in the hearth. The wind howled outside. The moment of connection, as intense as it was, had passed, leaving a fragile, uncertain quiet in its wake. He could feel the trembling start in her body again. A different kind of tremor this time. It was the aftershock. He gently took her by the shoulders and led her to the chair by the fire, sitting her down and draping the blanket over her again. She did not resist. She seemed spent, hollowed out. He sat in his own chair, the small space between them feeling like a vast, empty canyon. He did not know what to say, what to do. The intimacy of the moment had changed everything and nothing. The danger was still out there. The secrets were still between them. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice a dead, emotionless whisper. She did not look at him, but stared into the dancing flames. "You will hate me when you know." He waited for her to continue, to explain the cryptic, chilling words, but she said nothing more. She simply pulled the blanket tighter around herself and retreated back into the silent, haunted country of her own mind, leaving him alone with the fire, the storm, and the terrible, unanswered question of what she had done, or what she thought she had done, on the night her husband was killed. The storm did not arrive with the courtesy of a warning. It simply descended, a great white beast that swallowed the sky and the land in a single, silent gulp. One moment, the world outside the cabin was a landscape of gray plains and dark, distant peaks. The next, it was nothing but a churning, blinding maelstrom of snow. The wind, which had been a mournful cry, became a physical force, a battering ram against the small cabin, seeking out every crack and crevice with a relentless, shrieking fury. They were trapped. The snow piled in drifts that buried the windows halfway, casting the interior of the cabin in a perpetual, gloomy twilight, even at midday. The world shrank to the 4 log walls, the flickering firelight, and the sound of the gale. For the first day, they existed in a state of suspended animation, 2 solitary figures orbiting the hearth, the unspoken tension of their last conversation a palpable presence in the room. Eli chopped the last of his split wood and stacked it inside, his face grim. He checked his stores of food, a 1/4 sack of flour, a small tin of coffee, a few pounds of salted pork, some dried beans, enough for a week. If they were careful, maybe less. Blizzards in this part of the country did not follow a schedule. On the second day, a section of the corral fence gave way under the weight of a massive snowdrift, the snapping of the wood barely audible over the roar of the wind. Eli's 2 horses, huddled in the lean-to, were now vulnerable. Without a second thought, he pulled on his heavy coat and hat, wrapped a scarf over the lower half of his face, and took up his axe and a coil of rope. "Stay inside and keep the fire fed," he ordered Lila, his voice muffled by the cloth. "Do not open this door for any reason." She watched him step out into the white chaos, and in an instant, he was nearly invisible, a dark shape struggling against a world that had turned to angry smoke. She stood at the door for a long time, her hand on the iron bolt, a cold dread seeping into her that had nothing to do with the temperature. The wind and snow were an enemy she could see, the one she could not see, The one Caleb Harper represented felt infinitely more dangerous. Eli was out there, exposed, for her. The thought was a disquieting one. He returned hours later, a figure of ice and exhaustion. His eyebrows and the scarf around his face were frozen solid. He stumbled inside, bringing a blast of frigid air with him, and collapsed into the chair by the fire. His body racked with shivers he could not control. He had managed a temporary fix on the fence, enough to keep the horses contained, but the effort had cost him dearly. By nightfall, the shivering had given way to a deep, consuming fever. He lay on his cot, his skin burning to the touch, his breathing shallow and labored. Lila, who had spent the better part of a week lost in the fog of her own trauma, was suddenly, violently, pulled back to the present. The man who had saved her was now helpless, and she was the only one there. For a moment, panic seized her. She was not a nurse. She knew nothing of healing. But as she looked at his still, feverish form, a different instinct took over. It was the simple, practical knowledge of a woman who knew that things had to be done. She found a clean cloth and tore it into strips. She kept a kettle on the fire. Constantly replenishing it with snow, she melted in a bucket and used the warm water to bathe his face and neck. He was delirious, muttering words she could not understand, his strong body tense with some internal struggle. She forced sips of water between his cracked lips, her touch gentle but firm. In the dim, flickering light of the cabin, the roles were reversed. He was the one lost in the darkness now, and she was the anchor, the sole guardian against the storm both inside and out. The second night of the fever was the worst. He thrashed in his sleep, his hands clenching the rough blanket. He was no longer in the cabin. His mind had taken him back to a place of smoke and fire and screaming. "Get down," he yelled, his voice raw with a terror that made the hair on Lila's arms stand up. "They are coming through the north wall. Hold the line." She knelt by the cot, placing a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. "Eli," she said softly, "you are safe. It is just a dream." He did not seem to hear her. His eyes were open but saw nothing in the room. "The church! Get the women and children to the church!" he gasped, his body arching in some remembered agony. Then his voice broke, his face contorting in a mask of pure anguish. He whispered a name, a single, clear word that cut through the delirium and the howling of the wind outside. "Clara." The name hung in the air, heavy with loss. He said it again, not as a command, but as a prayer, a lament. "Clara, I am sorry. I am so sorry." He turned his head to the side, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. Then, as quickly as it came, the violent memory passed, leaving him limp and unconscious, his breathing still ragged. Lila sat back on her heels, the name echoing in her mind. Clara. It was the name of a ghost. She felt a strange kinship with this unseen woman, this source of his pain. She looked at the man on the cot, no longer just a quiet, brooding stranger, but a man with a history etched in scars, both visible and invisible. She did not know who Clara was, and she knew it was not her place to ask. It was his story to tell, or to keep. She simply renewed the compress on his forehead and settled into the chair to keep her vigil, the shared space of the small cabin now feeling less like a prison and more like a sanctuary, a fragile shelter for two haunted people. The storm broke on the fourth day. The wind died down, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered through the snow-caked windows. Eli's fever had broken with it. He woke to find Lila asleep in the chair, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle, the ever-present wedding dress looking even more forlorn in the pale light. He felt weak, his body aching as if he had been beaten, but his mind was clear for the first time in days. He saw the basin of water by his cot, the neatly folded cloths, the small portion of broth she had left for him on the hearth. She had cared for him, despite her own brokenness. She had tended to his. A profound, unsettling feeling moved through him. Gratitude. mixed with something else he was not ready to name. Over the next few days, as his strength slowly returned, the atmosphere between them shifted again. The raw desperation that had led to their kiss was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared vulnerability. They were two survivors, bound by the storm that had trapped them. They spoke little, but the silence was different now, companionable. She would read from one of the few books on his shelf, her voice a low murmur against the backdrop of the dripping icicles outside. He would watch her, noting the way the firelight caught the dark strands of her hair, the deep well of sadness that never quite left her eyes. One evening, as she was staring into the flames, she spoke, her voice so soft he almost did not hear her. He was not the man you think he was. Eli was sitting at the table, cleaning his pistol, a task that soothed him with its familiar mechanics. He stopped, his hand still, and waited. He knew she was talking about Joel. "My marriage, it was an arrangement," she continued, her gaze fixed on the fire. "My father's business was failing. The Harpers had land, money. Joel came east looking for a wife. And my father, he saw a solution. I was part of a transaction." She said the words without self-pity, a simple statement of fact. "He seemed like a gentleman at first, polite. He said all the right things, but on the journey out here, he began to change. Or maybe he did not change. Maybe I just began to see the man who was always there." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "He was a man who liked to be in control of everything. What I wore, what I said, how I sat. He told me the West was no place for a woman with opinions. He said my only purpose was to give him sons and keep his house. Every day, I felt myself getting smaller." Eli remained silent, listening. He had seen men like Joel Harper in the army, men who confused cruelty with strength and power with respect. Lila took a shaky breath. There was someone, before, back home, a boy I had known my whole life. We were to be married, but he had nothing to offer my father. When I left, he gave me a letter. He told me to read it if I ever felt I had made a mistake. It was foolish, I know, to keep it, but it was the only thing I had that was truly mine." The pieces began to click into place for Eli. The letter, Caleb's cold fury. This was not about bad luck. "The night we were to arrive at the ranch, our wedding night, he found it," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was in my trunk. He was looking for something else, I do not know what, and he found it. He called me a liar, a traitor. He said I had betrayed him, that I was soiled." Her voice broke on the last word. He grabbed my arm, and his face, it was a mask of pure rage. He said he would teach me what it meant to be a Harper wife. He said he would break me. She finally turned from the fire to look at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I was so scared. I pulled away from him, and I just ran from the wagon, into the darkness. I did not get far. That is when I heard the first shot." She buried her face in her hands. "He was shouting my name, and then there were more shots. I just stayed hidden in the rocks, praying they would not find me. I do not know who shot him. Eli, I do not know if they were there for him, or if it was just random. All I know is that he was calling for me, and I did not go to him. I was a coward. I let him die alone." The guilt she had been carrying, the secret shame, poured out of her in a torrent of quiet, agonized sobs. She was haunted not by his death, but by the thought that in her heart, she had been glad to be free of him, and that her inaction had made her a participant in his murder. Eli got up slowly, his legs still unsteady, and walked over to the hearth. He did not touch her. He simply stood beside her chair, a silent, solid presence. He let her cry until the sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. When she finally looked up at him, her face ravaged with guilt, he spoke, his voice low and raspy. "There was a town," he began, his eyes looking past her, into a memory. "On the border, It was not much, just a collection of sod houses and a half-built church. I was stationed there with my company. There was a girl who worked in the small store. Her name was Clara. Lila's breath hitched. She stared at him, her own grief momentarily forgotten. She was kind, Eli continued, the words coming slowly, as if pulled from a great depth. She had a laugh that made you forget where you were. We were going to... It does not matter. One night, raiders came across the border. They were not soldiers. They were just men who liked to burn and kill. They set fire to the town. My commander ordered us to fall back, to consolidate our position. He said the town was a lost cause. He paused, his jaw tightening. But Clara was still in there. Her family. I disobeyed orders. I ran back in. I found her in the burning store, trying to pull her younger sister out from under a fallen beam. I got the sister out, and I went back for her. As I was carrying her out into the street, a stray bullet hit her. It was dark, chaotic. I did not even know she was hurt until I felt the warmth spreading across my coat. He looked down at his own hands, as if he could still see the blood on them. She died in my arms, right there in the middle of the street. She never even made a sound. Her blood soaked into my uniform. I wore that coat for another year, but I could never wash the stain out. It was a part of me. He finally looked at Lila. His eyes meeting hers, he saw not pity, but a deep, profound understanding. She was a woman who knew what it was like to wear the stain of another's death. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of the confession. He did not touch her skin. Instead, his fingers gently brushed against the torn, blood-stained sleeve of her wedding dress. The fabric was rough, a stark contrast to the memory of the fine wool of his army coat. But the meaning was the same. They were both clinging to a shroud, a physical reminder of their deepest failure, their greatest loss. "We both keep dead things close," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. In that moment, the space between them was bridged. They were no longer a rescuer and a victim. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin, two souls marked by a past that refused to be buried. The end of the storm left the world reborn and silent. A brilliant, blinding sun shone down on a landscape of pure, unbroken white. The snow, which had been a raging enemy, was now a blanket of pristine peace, smoothing the harsh lines of the prairie into soft, gentle curves. But the silence was a lie. The end of their isolation was not a reprieve. It was an invitation. The world, which had been held at bay, was now coming for them. The first rider came 3 days later. He did not approach the cabin directly, but sat on his horse on a ridge half a mile distant, a dark, solitary figure against the snow, watching. Eli saw him from the window, his hand immediately going to the rifle he now kept propped by the door. He said nothing to Lila, but she saw the change in him, the way his body went still and alert, the way his eyes became hard and distant. The rider stayed for an hour, a silent, ominous presence, and then turned and rode back the way he had come. 2 days after that, 2 more men appeared. They rode closer, circling the clearing, their faces grim and purposeful. They were townsfolk, men Eli recognized from the mercantile. They were not here for a social call. They were a scouting party, measuring, assessing. Lila stood behind Eli, her hands clenched in the fabric of her dress. "They know I am here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let them look," Eli said, his voice a low rumble. He did not move from his post at the window. He was a stone wall, a barrier of quiet, menacing intent. After making a slow circuit of the cabin, the men conferred, then rode off. The confrontation came the following day. A single rider, but this one came with purpose, kicking his horse through the deep snow right up to the front of the cabin. He was a big, barrel-chested man with a thick beard and self-righteous eyes. Eli recognized him as Jedediah Stone, a rancher who held considerable sway in town, a man who believed his own opinions were gospel. Eli met him on the porch, his rifle held loosely but ready at his side. He did not invite the man to dismount. "Thatcher!" Stone boomed, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet air. "The town is concerned, deeply concerned." "The town can mind its own business," Eli said, his voice flat and cold. Stone bristled, his face reddening. "It is our business when a man harbors a curse. We know you have that Harper woman in there. A woman whose husband dies on her wedding night is an unnatural thing. She brings misfortune. The only unnatural thing I see is a man trespassing on my land to speak nonsense," Eli replied, his grip tightening slightly on the rifle. "She is dangerous," Stone insisted, ignoring the threat. "The women are scared. They say she has the evil eye. The Harper family has disowned her. She has no place here. You need to turn her over. The sheriff can hold her until the circuit judge comes in the spring. For her own safety, of course." The lie was so bald, so transparent, that Eli almost laughed. "Her safety," he repeated, his voice laced with ice. "You ride all the way out here, spouting fear and superstition, and you tell me it is for her safety?" He took a single step forward, and the movement was so filled with contained violence that Stone's horse shifted nervously beneath him. "She is under my protection. Now get off my land." "This is not the end of it, Thatcher," Stone snarled, pulling on his reins. "You are making a powerful enemy in this town, siding with that witch." He spat the word onto the clean snow, then turned his horse and galloped away, his anger a visible cloud in the frigid air. Eli watched him go, his jaw set like granite. When he turned and went back inside, he found Lila standing in the middle of the room, her face as white as the snow outside. "You heard," he said. It was not a question. "A curse," she whispered, her eyes wide with a familiar, haunted look. "A witch. That is what they will say. That is what they will believe." She looked at him, her expression a mixture of terror and despair. "He is right, Eli. You cannot do this. You cannot fight the whole town for me." "I am not fighting the town. I am telling a fool to stay off my property." "It is more than that, and you know it," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "They will not stop. They will come back. They will come back for you. They will destroy you because of me." She took a step toward him, her hands outstretched in a plea. "Please, you have to make me leave. Send me away. It is the only way you will be safe. I bring ruin. My husband is dead, and now I will bring it to you. I am a curse. Eli." He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He took her by the shoulders, his grip firm but not harsh, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "You are not a curse. You are a survivor. There is a difference. What happened to you was not your fault. What happened to Joel was not your fault. I have seen real evil. Lila, it looks like Caleb Harper. It looks like men who whisper poison in a town square. It does not look like you." His words, spoken with such fierce certainty, seemed to break through the wall of her guilt. The fight went out of her, replaced by a deep, shuddering exhaustion. She sagged against him, and he held her, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that was more about support than passion. "I am so afraid," she confessed into his chest, her voice muffled. "I know," he said, his hand stroking her tangled hair. "But you are not alone in it. Not anymore." They stood like that for a long time as the afternoon sun cast long blue shadows across the snow. The cabin was quiet, a tiny island of warmth in a cold and hostile world. That evening, a silent understanding passed between them. The confession of their pasts, the siege of the present, had forged a bond that neither could deny. As Lila stood by the fire, her silhouette flickering against the log wall, she began, with slow, trembling fingers, to unbutton the collar of the ruined wedding dress. Eli watched, his breath catching in his throat, It was an act of profound surrender and profound trust. One by one, the small pearl buttons came undone. The torn, stained linen, which had been her armor and her shroud for so long, loosened its hold on her. She shrugged it from her shoulders, letting it fall to the floor in a crumpled heap. Underneath, she wore a simple, thin chemise, her shoulders and arms bare in the firelight. He saw the faint, pale lines of scars on her skin, a map of a life that had been harder than he knew. She stood before him, stripped of her past, vulnerable and uncertain, her eyes searching his for judgment, for pity. He saw neither. He saw a woman of incredible strength, a woman who had walked through hell and was still standing. He walked to where the dress lay on the floor and picked it up. He did not look at it with disgust. He held it with a strange reverence, the weight of her story in his hands. He went to a large, dusty trunk that sat at the foot of his cot, a place where he kept old army blankets and things he no longer used. He opened it, the hinges groaning in protest. He carefully folded the tattered dress, the bloodstains and the dirt and the torn lace, and placed it inside. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He closed the lid and turned to face her. "It is part of you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The part that lived. It does not deserve to be thrown away, but you do not have to wear it anymore." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release. He crossed back to her, and this time, when he reached for her, it was different. He cupped her face in his hands, his rough palms gentle against her skin. The air crackled with a tension that was no longer about fear or grief. It was about the desperate, undeniable need to feel alive, to reclaim a part of themselves that the world had tried to steal. The wind had picked up again outside, a low, mournful howl that seemed to magnify the warmth and stillness within the cabin. He kissed her, and this time, it was not the desperate, drowning kiss of the storm. It was tender, searching, a question and an answer all at once. It was an exploration of the uncharted territory of trust. She responded with a desperate intensity of her own, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, as if she could absorb his strength into herself. Their coming together was not an escape from their pasts, but a reclamation of their present. It was a silent, powerful declaration that they would not be defined by the ghosts they carried. It was a language of scars, of survival, of two lonely, broken souls finding a fragile, fierce wholeness in each other's arms. As the wind howled and the fire burned low, they made love, not to forget the death that surrounded them, but to defiantly, desperately choose life. The next morning, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. The world outside was still cold, the threats still real, but inside, something had fundamentally shifted. They were a unit now, a partnership forged in fire and ice. While Eli was outside tending to the horses, Lila sat on the floor by the trunk, tracing the intricate patterns of the old wood with her finger. It was the place where her old life had been laid to rest. As her fingers moved over the dark, aged surface, they caught on a small, carved indentation near the lock. She looked closer. It was not part of the decorative carving. It was a symbol, deliberately burned into the wood, a twisted serpent biting the end of a riding spur. It meant nothing to her, just an odd, crude mark. But when Eli came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, she showed it to him. He froze. He knelt beside the trunk, his face a mask of grim recognition. "Where did you get this trunk?" she asked. "It is not mine," he said, his voice low and tight. "It was here when I bought the claim. The man who owned it before me. He left in a hurry." He looked from the symbol on the trunk to her face, and she could see the pieces of a puzzle falling into place in his eyes. "This mark," he said, tracing it with his finger. "It is the brand of the Cimarron Raiders, a gang of outlaws that used to run the territory years back. They were thieves and killers for hire. He stood up and began to pace the small cabin, his mind racing. Caleb Harper, before his family got respectable, he rode with them. It was a long time ago, a secret the family buried deep. But men like that, they do not change. They just learn to wear better clothes. Lila stood up, her heart pounding. The symbol, Caleb's connection to outlaws, his raw hatred for her, so much greater than simple family disapproval. His chilling words, that girl should have burned with the wagon. It was not a figure of speech. It was a statement of intent. He wanted Joel's inheritance, she said, the words tumbling out as the horrifying truth dawned on her. Joel was the firstborn. He stood to get the entire ranch. Caleb was to get nothing. If Joel died, and his new bride died with him, it would all go to Caleb. It was all there. The cut harness, the ambush that was too precise to be a random robbery, the town being turned against her, the only surviving witness. They had not just wanted Joel dead, they had wanted her erased, her story buried with her body. But she had survived, and now she was a threat. A new fire ignited in her eyes, a fire that had nothing to do with grief or fear. It was the cold, hard flame of resolve. We have to prove it, she said, her voice steady and clear. We have to uncover the truth. She looked at Eli, her gaze unwavering. This is not about revenge, Eli. It is about being free. I cannot spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, being seen as a curse or a murderer. I will not let him bury me. Eli stopped pacing and looked at her. He saw the woman who had shivered in fear now standing tall with purpose. He knew she was right, but he also knew the cost. To fight Caleb Harper meant going back into Clayton. It meant confronting the whispers, the lies, the weak-willed sheriff, and the corrupt heart of the town. It meant digging up a past that was violent and bloody. His own past, as well as Caleb's. The skills he would need were not those of a quiet homesteader. They were the skills of a soldier, a survivor, a man who knew how to operate in the shadows. He was reluctant. He had built this quiet life, this solitude, as a penance and a shield. To go back into that world was to risk becoming the man he had fought so hard to leave behind. He looked at her, at the quiet determination on her face, at the trust in her eyes. She was asking him to not just protect her, but to fight for her. He thought of Clara, of his failure to save her. Perhaps this was not a return, but a second chance, a chance to do it right. He let out a long, slow breath, a final surrender to a fate he had not chosen, but one that had chosen him. He walked over to her and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. All right, he said, his voice a low, somber vow. We will do it. He looked into her eyes, and he wanted her to understand the price. But if I go back into that town, Lila, I will be a man I buried long ago. The journey into Clayton was a descent into enemy territory. They rode not as a man and a woman, but as two shadows detaching themselves from the gray twilight of the plains. They left before dawn, the world a canvas of charcoal and pale rose, the snow on the ground absorbing all sound, making their horses' progress an eerie, muffled procession. Lila was no longer the ghost in the tattered white wedding dress. She was now a different kind of specter, clad in a severe black wool dress Eli had owned, a relic from his mother that he had kept packed away in the bottom of a trunk. It was too large for her, but under a heavy black shawl and with a thick widow's veil covering her face, she was transformed. She was no longer Lila Harper, the cursed bride. She was an anonymous figure of grief, a woman a town might pity, but would not look at too closely. The disguise was an armor of social convention, and it was a heavier weight than the blood-stained linen had ever been. Eli, for his part, wore his oldest, most battered coat and a low-brimmed hat that obscured his features. His disguise was not in what he wore, but in how he moved. The quiet, solitary homesteader was gone, and in his place was the soldier he had tried to bury. He rode with a tense, watchful stillness, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape, his body a coiled spring. He was a man re-entering a battlefield he had sworn he would never walk again, and every nerve was alive with the grim muscle memory of it. They did not ride down the main street. Eli led them on a wide, circuitous route, entering Clayton from the south, through a tangle of neglected alleys that smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. He dismounted in the deep shadow between the livery and the assay office, tying their horses where they would not be easily seen. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice a low command. "Keep your head down. The veil will do most of the work, but do not draw attention. We are ghosts here. You understand?" Lila nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Through the dark mesh of the veil, the town looked distorted, a world seen through a spider's web. Every window seemed like a watching eye, every slam of a distant door a gunshot. Their first goal was information, concrete proof to anchor their suspicions. While Lila found a seat on a cold, secluded bench near the town's water pump, a respectable position for a grieving widow to rest. Eli melted into the shadows. He moved with a predator's grace, using the alleys and the deep afternoon shadows as his cover. He spent an hour behind the saloon, his back pressed against the rough-hewn planks, listening to the low murmur of conversations leaking through the walls. He heard his own name mentioned, spoken with a mixture of contempt and fear. He heard Lila's story told and retold, each version more monstrous than the last. She was a witch, a black widow, a woman who had driven her husband to a mad death. But amidst the gossip, he caught a crucial thread. He heard one of Caleb Harper's ranch hands boasting about his boss's good fortune, how the whole Harper estate was now Caleb's, free and clear, since the marriage to that Eastern girl had produced no heir. Next, Eli made his way to the small clapboard building that served as the county clerk's office. He slipped in through the back, a move he had learned long ago, and found himself in a dusty storage room filled with old records. It took him 20 minutes of sifting through brittle, yellowed papers before he found what he was looking for: the Harper land deeds. The original deed was clear. The property and all assets belonged to Joel Harper. A second, more recent document, filed just a month before the wedding, was a succession agreement. In the event of Joel's death without a living child, the entire estate would pass directly and immediately to his younger brother, Caleb. There was no provision for a widow. Lila had been written out of Joel's life before she had ever truly been written in. It was a death warrant disguised as a legal document. While Eli hunted for paper truths, Lila faced a more visceral ordeal. She sat on the bench, a statue of mourning, forcing herself to breathe slowly as townsfolk passed. Some gave her a wide berth, as if she were contagious. Others stared, their curiosity a physical violation. A woman dressed in gingham with 2 small children in tow stopped and pointed, whispering to her children, who then stared at Lila with wide, fearful eyes. The shame and anger burned in her chest, a hot, bitter acid. She wanted to scream, to tear the veil from her face and tell them all the truth, but she held on to Eli's words. "We are ghosts here." Late in the afternoon, they met back in the alley. Eli's face was grim in the fading light. He told her what he had found, his voice low and devoid of emotion. The land deed, the whispers, it was all true. The motive was as plain and ugly as a branding iron. "There is one more thing we need," Eli said. "Something that connects Caleb directly to the attack. Something more than motive." Lila knew what he meant. They needed a confession, however small, and she knew there was only one way to get it. "The churchyard," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "He visits his brother's grave every day at sundown. The whole town sees him. The grieving brother." Eli's eyes searched hers. "Lila, you do not have to do this." "Yes," she said, a new, hard resolve in her voice. "I do." The churchyard was cold and quiet, the setting sun casting long, skeletal shadows from the leaning headstones. A fresh wooden cross marked Joel's grave, a stark, raw wound in the frozen earth. Caleb was already there, his back to them, His head bowed. He was the perfect picture of a man in mourning. Lila took a deep, steadying breath, the cold air burning her lungs. "I will go alone," she told Eli. "He will not speak freely if you are there. Stay by the gate, but stay hidden." Eli did not like it, but he knew she was right. He watched her walk away, a solitary figure in black moving through a field of the dead. He slipped behind a large, gnarled oak tree just inside the stone wall, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, every muscle in his body screaming with the need to protect her. Lila approached the grave slowly, her steps deliberate, her head bowed as if in prayer. "Caleb," she said, her voice soft and trembling, a perfect imitation of a broken woman. He turned, his face showing surprise, which quickly hardened into contempt. "What are you doing here?" he hissed. "You are not welcome." "I came to ask for your forgiveness," Lila said, her words catching on a fabricated sob. She knelt in the snow beside the grave, not looking at him, but at the cold, hard dirt. "I was a bad wife. I was selfish. I ran when I should have stayed. Joel, he died because of me. I know you hate me. You have every right." Her performance was flawless. She was playing the part the town had already assigned her, the guilty, hysterical woman. Caleb was silent for a long moment, watching her. She could feel his suspicion warring with his arrogance. His arrogance won. He believed she was broken, that she had come crawling back to beg for scraps from the family that had discarded her. "Forgiveness is for the Lord to give," he said, his voice dripping with false piety. "But you are right. You were a bad wife. You were never good enough for him. You brought nothing but trouble and secrets with you." "I know," she whispered, daring to look up at him through her veil. Her eyes were wide and pleading. I do not understand why it had to happen. That night, it was so fast. The fire." Caleb's face tightened at the mention of the fire. A flicker of something ugly and impatient crossed his features. He took a step closer, looming over her. "It was a tragedy," he said, but his voice was cold, devoid of any real emotion. "A tragedy that was meant to be cleaner." Lila held her breath. This was it. She pushed, gently. "I do not know how I survived. It is a miracle, I suppose." A sneer twisted Caleb's lips. His arrogance, his belief in his own cleverness, finally betrayed him. "Miracle?" he scoffed, his voice a low, vicious snarl. "It was a mistake. You were not supposed to make it out of that fire." The words, so casually cruel, so damning, hung in the frigid air like a death sentence. He had said it. He had confessed. In his mind, he was speaking to a pathetic, broken creature he had already defeated. He had no idea he was speaking to his executioner. From his hiding place, Eli heard the words and a murderous, white-hot rage surged through him. The man he had buried, the soldier who had seen too much death, clawed its way to the surface. His hand tightened on his pistol, and for a single, terrifying second, he was ready to step out from behind the tree and end Caleb Harper right there, among the dead. But then he saw Lila. She did not flinch. She did not cry out. She simply remained kneeling, her head bowed, absorbing the poison of Caleb's words. Her strength, her incredible, steely control, pulled him back from the brink. This was her victory, won with cunning, not with violence. He forced himself to remain still, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Lila slowly got to her feet, her act of the broken widow complete. "Thank you for your honesty, Caleb," she said, her voice still a meek whisper. She turned and walked back toward the gate, her posture still slumped in feigned defeat. She did not look back. She did not have to. She reached the gate and walked past Eli's hiding place without a word. He fell into step behind her, and they moved quickly, melting back into the deepening shadows of the town. They did not speak until they were back with the horses, hidden in the alley. "Did you hear?" she asked, her voice now hard and clear. "I heard," he said, his own voice tight with restrained violence. Their next stop was the town's small sheriff's office. They had their proof, but it was worthless without the law to back it. Eli went in alone, leaving Lila with the horses. He found Sheriff Brody, a man with a drooping mustache and tired, evasive eyes, warming his feet by the stove. Eli laid it out for him, calmly and concisely. The land deed, the threats, Caleb's confession in the churchyard. He told the sheriff that Lila was a witness to a murder and that her life was in danger. Sheriff Brody listened, his expression shifting from boredom to discomfort. He cleared his throat and refused to meet Eli's gaze. "Now, Thatcher," he said, his voice placating. "That is a mighty serious accusation to be leveling against one of our most prominent citizens. Caleb Harper is a good man, a grieving man." "He is a killer," Eli said, his voice flat. "All you have is the word of a hysterical woman," Brody countered, his tone hardening. "A woman of questionable character. There is no proof of any of what you say. I cannot arrest a man like Caleb Harper on the basis of gossip." "It is not gossip. It is a confession." "Hearsay," the sheriff snapped. "And I will not have you or that woman stirring up trouble in my town. I suggest you take her and ride far away from here. The Harpers have long memories. It would be healthier for you both." The threat was unmistakable. The law in Clayton was not blind. It was bought and paid for. Eli stared at the sheriff for a long moment, a look of pure contempt on his face. He turned without another word and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. Justice was not going to be found here. They could not stay in town. It was too dangerous now. Eli knew of only one safe harbor. He led them through the dark streets to the edge of town, to the blacksmith's forge. The ring of a hammer on an anvil still echoed in the night air. A steady, rhythmic heartbeat. A tall, broad-shouldered man with skin the color of polished mahogany stood silhouetted in the fiery glow of the forge. "Joshua," Eli called out softly. The man, Joshua Blackwood, turned. He was a man of immense physical presence, his arms corded with the muscle of his trade. He had a calm, steady face and eyes that had seen more of the world than most. He and Eli had served in the same colored cavalry regiment years ago. They had a bond forged in battle, a trust that needed no words. Joshua's eyes took in the scene, Eli's tense posture, the veiled woman behind him. He simply nodded. "The barn," he said, his voice a deep, resonant bass. "The loft is warm. No one will find you there." That night, they slept in the hayloft, the scent of hay and horses and coal smoke a comforting blanket. For the first time in weeks, Lila felt a flicker of safety, but it was fleeting. The reality of their situation settled on her in the deep, quiet hours of the night. The town was against them. The law was against them. Caleb knew she had survived, and now he knew she was a threat. They had poked the hornet's nest, and soon the swarm would come for them. She sat up, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Eli was asleep nearby, a dark shape in the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the barn wall. She could leave. She could slip out now, take one of the horses and just ride, disappear, find a new town, a new name, live her life as a ghost, always looking over her shoulder, but alive. It was the coward's way out, the same impulse that had made her run from the wagon. Eli stirred, as if sensing her turmoil. "What is it?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "We cannot win this," she whispered, the words a surrender. "The whole world is against us. We should leave. Eli, just disappear. We can go west, to Oregon, or California, somewhere no one knows us." He sat up and looked at her, his face unreadable in the dim light. He reached out and gently took her hand. "Running is not living, Lila," he said softly. "It is just a slower way to die." He moved closer, and she could feel the warmth of his body, a steady, grounding presence. "You have faced down your own ghosts. You have faced down Caleb Harper. You have survived too much to disappear now." He told her then about the circuit judge, a man named Isaac Parker, who was rumored to be a hard but fair man. He was due to arrive in Clayton in the spring. "He is real law. Lila," Eli said. "Not like Brody. If we can present our case to him, if we can get other people to speak, we might have a chance, a real one." The idea of waiting, of staying here in the heart of the danger, terrified her. But the idea of running, of letting Caleb win, of letting him erase her, was worse. It would be a betrayal of the woman she was slowly, painfully, becoming. Eli raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. Then, his eyes holding hers, he leaned forward and gently kissed the pale, thin scar near her collarbone, a faint line from where she had been thrown from the wagon. The touch was incredibly tender, an acceptance of everything she was, everything she had endured. "You are not dying," he whispered against her skin, his words a direct answer to her desperate plea during the storm. "You are learning how to live." In the quiet of the hayloft, surrounded by the sleeping life of the barn, a new resolve settled in her heart. He was right. She had survived. Now, it was time to live, together, in the pale light of the moon. They began to forge a new plan. A plan not just to run, not just to hide, but to fight. A plan to expose the truth, to protect each other, and to reclaim the life that the world, and the men in it, had tried so hard to bury. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly, as if winter itself was unwilling to release its grip on the land. Patches of brown earth appeared like bruises on the snow, and the creek beside Eli's cabin began to whisper again. The sound of its current, a restless secret beneath a thinning sheet of ice. With the promise of spring came the promise of the circuit judge, and with it, a tension that was a living thing in the small cabin. Their time in hiding, protected by Joshua's loyalty and the town's reluctance to confront the formidable blacksmith, was coming to an end. Caleb Harper could feel the changing season as well. He could not afford to let the truth survive until the judge's arrival. The whispers he had so carefully cultivated were no longer enough. He needed to extinguish the threat, and he began to move with the open arrogance of a man who believed the law was his to command. Men who worked for the Harper Ranch began to appear in town, their presence a constant, low-grade threat. They loitered outside the blacksmith's forge, their eyes cold and watchful. Sheriff Brody, when questioned by Joshua, would simply shrug and say they were free men, allowed to stand where they pleased. The pressure mounted. The mercantile owner suddenly found he was out of the specific grade of coal Joshua needed for his forge. The woman who sold fresh bread claimed her ovens were broken. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation, an attempt to isolate them, to make them an island in a hostile sea. They were being starved out, not with guns, but with the quiet, collective cruelty of a town that had chosen its side. Lila felt the noose tightening with every passing day. The fear was a constant, cold companion, but it was different now. It was no longer the paralyzing terror of a victim, but the sharp, alert fear of a soldier before a battle. She spent her days with Eli and Joshua, planning, talking, gathering their meager resources. Joshua had sent word via a trusted freight driver to a neighboring county, a message for Judge Parker, outlining the danger and urging him to make haste, but there was no guarantee the message would even arrive. The end came on a cold, blustery afternoon in early April. A boy, no older than 12, was sent with a message. He stood at a distance from the forge, his face pale, and recited the words he had been paid to memorize. "Caleb Harper and the concerned citizens of Clayton give you till sundown. Be gone from this territory, both the man and the woman. If you are still here when the sun sets, we will burn you out." The boy turned and ran before anyone could reply. The ultimatum was a death sentence. There was nowhere to run. To be caught on the open plains was to be slaughtered. "He means it," Joshua said, his deep voice grim as he banked the fires in his forge. "He will bring a mob. He will call it a posse, and Brody will give it his blessing." "We cannot stay here," Eli said, his eyes on Lila. "He will burn this place to the ground to get to us. We will not bring that on you, Joshua." "I am not afraid of them," the blacksmith stated, his jaw set. "We know," Lila said, her voice quiet but firm. "That is why we cannot let them destroy what you have built." She looked at Eli, a silent communication passing between them. They had a plan, a desperate gamble they had prepared for this very moment. "The old granary," she said, "at the east end of town. It is stone and timber, harder to burn, and it overlooks the road the judge would have to take." Before they left, Lila had one last task. She rode with Eli, taking the fastest of Joshua's horses, on a swift, dangerous trip back to the cabin. The small log home felt like a lifetime away. She went directly to the trunk at the foot of the cot. Her hands did not tremble as she lifted the lid. She reached in and pulled out the tattered, stained, and torn white wedding dress. Eli watched her, his face a mask of concern. "Lila," he said, his voice gentle, "you do not have to do that." "Yes, I do," she said, her eyes meeting his. They were clear and resolved. "They made this dress a shroud. They used it to bury me in lies. Tonight, I am going to make it my flag." The old granary stood like a forgotten fortress against the bruised twilight sky. It was a large, dilapidated structure, its stone foundation solid, its high windows like vacant eyes. Inside, it smelled of dust, ancient grain, and the cold scent of impending violence. Joshua barricaded the main doors with heavy timbers, while Eli took up a position in the upper loft, his rifle resting on a wooden sill overlooking the main street. He had a clear line of sight. Lila stood in the cavernous space below, the last rays of the setting sun slanting through the dusty air, illuminating the floating motes of dust like 1,000 tiny ghosts. She had put on the dress. It hung on her, a shocking, brutal testament to the violence she had endured. It was not the dress of a bride, nor the dress of a victim. It was the armor of a warrior. They did not have to wait long. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep, purple gloom, they came. It was not an orderly posse. It was a mob, a river of angry men carrying torches and rifles, their faces a mixture of hatred, fear, and the false courage of whiskey. Caleb Harper was at their head, his face contorted in a mask of righteous fury. Sheriff Brody was with them, a pathetic figure trying to lend an air of legitimacy to a lynch mob. "Thatcher!" Caleb's voice boomed, echoing in the cold air. "Send out the woman. We have a warrant for her arrest for the murder of my brother." From the loft window, Eli's voice rang out, cold and clear. "You have no warrant, Brody, and this is not a posse. It is a mob of cowards led by a killer." A roar of anger went up from the men. A shot was fired, the bullet splintering the wood far to the left of Eli's position. "You are harboring a fugitive and a witch!" Jedediah Stone shouted, his voice thick with a fanatic's certainty. "We are here to cleanse our town!" The men surged forward, but stopped just out of clear rifle range. They were a pack of wolves, circling, waiting for the moment to strike. Caleb was shouting, inciting them, his words a poison of lies and superstition. He told them Lila had bewitched her husband, that she had consorted with outlaws, that her presence would bring crop failure and disease. It was a mad, desperate litany of fear. Just as the mob was about to rush the doors, they groaned open, not from the outside, but from within. A profound silence fell over the crowd as Lila stepped out into the torchlight. She was alone, a stark, pale figure in a ruined dress. The firelight flickered on the dark, dried blood, on the torn lace, on her pale, determined face. The sight of her, so defiant and so completely vulnerable, stunned the mob into a momentary stillness. She did not shout. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear. and it carried in the tense silence with the unnerving clarity of a bell. "You have come to kill a witch," she said, her gaze sweeping over their faces, meeting the eyes of men who had averted their gazes from her on the street. "You have come to silence a curse, but I am not a witch, I am a witness." She told them her story. She started from the beginning, from the arranged marriage, her voice steady and unwavering. She spoke of Joel's cruelty on the trail west, of his rage and possessiveness. She told them about the letter, and about the fight in the wagon on their wedding night. "Your grief is a lie. Caleb Harper," she said, her eyes finding him in the crowd, pinning him with the force of her words. "You did not mourn your brother. You celebrated his death." She told them of the ambush, of the men who had shot Joel down in cold blood. She told them how she had run, not from bravery, but from terror. And then she told them about her confrontation with Caleb in the churchyard. "I knelt at my husband's grave," she said, her voice ringing with the power of the truth. "And his own brother, the man who stands before you now, told me that I was never supposed to make it out of that fire. He confessed to me that my survival was a mistake." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Some men began to look at Caleb, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. Caleb's face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. "She is a liar!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "A madwoman! Do not listen to her!" "Then ask him," Lila challenged, her voice rising. "Ask him about the land deed that made him the sole heir. Ask Sheriff Brody why he refused to investigate a murder. Ask these men," she said, pointing to the ranchers who had watched Eli's cabin, "why they were paid to watch an innocent woman. I am not the curse in this town. The curse is the greed and the silence that lets a man like this get away with murder." The mob was no longer a single, unified entity. It was a collection of individuals, their certainty shaken, their anger now mixed with confusion and shame. Just as Caleb raised his rifle, ready to silence her permanently, a new sound cut through the tension, the unmistakable clatter of a heavy carriage and a team of horses, moving at a fast clip down the main road. The carriage pulled to a halt, and a tall, imposing man with a stern face and a thick gray beard stepped out. He was dressed in a black frock coat, and he carried with him an aura of absolute, unassailable authority. "What in the name of the United States government is the meaning of this armed assembly?" he demanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. Sheriff Brody scurried forward, his face pale. "Judge Parker, we were just maintaining the peace." Judge Parker's cold eyes surveyed the scene. The armed mob, the terrified sheriff, Eli in the window above, and the lone woman in the blood-stained dress. "It looks to me—" "Sheriff," the judge said, his voice dripping with scorn, "like you were about to preside over a lynching." The arrival of the judge broke the spell. With real law now present, the mob's courage evaporated. Judge Parker took control with swift, decisive authority. He listened to Lila's testimony again, this time as a formal deposition. Eli came down from the loft and presented the Harper land deeds. And then, a small miracle happened. Emboldened by Lila's courage, and by the presence of a judge who could not be bought, a few people stepped forward. The mercantile owner admitted that Caleb had been buying up his brother's debts for months. One of Caleb's own ranch hands, a young man with a conscience, confessed that Caleb had paid him and others to stage the ambush, to make it look like a robbery. By the time the sun rose, Caleb Harper was in shackles, charged with conspiracy and the murder of his brother. Sheriff Brody was stripped of his badge and placed under arrest for obstruction of justice. The mob had long since dissolved, the men slinking back to their homes in the gray light of dawn, their faces etched with the shame of what they had almost done. The ride back to the cabin was quiet. The plains, which had once seemed so menacing, now felt peaceful, washed clean by the morning light. The land was still harsh. The town was still a place of cold memories. But something fundamental had changed within them. They were no longer hiding. They rode side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing, a comfortable, unspoken understanding between them. When they reached the cabin, Lila dismounted and untied the bundle from her saddle. She took the wedding dress and walked to a spot beneath a young cottonwood tree whose leaves were just beginning to bud. She knelt in the soft, damp earth and, with her bare hands, she dug a shallow hole. She folded the dress carefully, the stained linen a map of her journey through the valley of death. She placed it in the earth and covered it, her hands patting the soil smooth. She remained kneeling for a moment, her head bowed. "This time," she whispered to the quiet earth, "I bury it alive." She was not burying a dead past. She was planting the seeds of her future, a future that would grow from the soil of her own survival. She stood and turned to Eli, who had been watching her, his expression one of profound tenderness. The sun was warm on her face. She walked to him, and the last of the fear, the last of the shame, fell away. She was whole. "Stay," she said, her voice clear and strong. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Not because I am broken, but because I am yours." He covered her hand with his own, his thumb stroking her skin. A slow smile, the first she had ever truly seen, spread across his face, transforming his harsh features. "I am not going anywhere," he said. As the spring deepened, they began to rebuild. They mended the fence together, their hands often touching as they worked. They patched the roof of the small cabin, making it strong against future storms. They were not just rebuilding a home, they were building a life, piece by piece with the quiet, steady work of their own two hands. One afternoon, as they stood in the yard, the sun warm on their shoulders, he pulled her into his arms, and finally, under the vast, open sky, with no shadows to hide in, he kissed her. It was a kiss not of desperation or of grief, but of a deep and abiding peace, a promise of all the sunlit days to come. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.